Mm, live already.
Looks like it. It's my thing though.
You got this.
Okay, we're live, I think. Huh?
You are. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Today we're doing our episode 5 of the Malcolm X's Successors series. And today me and Hanbal Shakur are together in the same room, and we're going to be doing it this way. So inshallah, we're going to be discussing the works of Russell Maroon Shoatz, who is an influential figure, longtime political prisoner, and we're very interested in his work. So we're going to be discussing a couple of essays. One is called The Hydra and the Dragon, and the other one is called On the Question of Violence. But before we start, I want to remind our viewers a couple of things. First, our fundraising, the Launch Good campaign, was changed because of Launch Good had a change in their processor. So we're waiting for them to change it to the next new processor that they're going to be using. So we're going to update you all about the fundraiser. And so just wait on more information from us, from our Facebook page, and from emails. The other thing is the series. What's next? We're going to also inform you about that about next week. There's a couple of options about next Saturday, but we're going to return to our original time, which was 10 a.m. Pacific time. Today we are early because we have another meeting after that we have to attend. I also want to inform our viewers that I woke up today with a pretty scary news that a brother who is very important young brother I know from my research and my work in Bangladesh was basically, technically speaking, disappeared. So, inshallah, this episode is dedicated to my dear brother Ashraf Mahdi, who um, was picked up a couple of days ago, and we don't know any information about where he's at. And so we're hoping, inshallah, that he's released soon enough. And if not, we're going to try to have a campaign related to that. Having said that, we're going to start today. Um, I think we're going to start with, it's more like a conversation today with Hannibal and me. We're going to start with the Hydra and the Dragon piece, the Dragon and the Hydra. And Hannibal, why don't you get started and I'll jump in and then I'll go into the next essay.
Yeah, sure. So this is a really important piece where Maroon is discussing a lot of the differences between organizational structure or tactical structure in terms of fighting and resistance. And he gives historical examples of both, and he gives examples of the character and how they can be, perceived over time in these various iterations. So one of the things, well, let me just say this, one of the reasons I thought it was really important to get into some of his writing is because of this historical analysis. And why that's important is because, at least for myself personally, in being involved with different organizing groups, I've dealt with so many different ideologies where, according to your ideology, this is how you're going to look at history. And not necessarily based on the historical events, but based on maybe historical schisms, conflicts, where, everyone from our camp automatically looks at everyone from this other camp in a particular way, even if we don't understand the historical conflict. And so, and that happens within milieu or within the spectrum of, you know, I guess you could say leftist or, you know, like alternative political traditions, ideologies, etc. So you have this thing where, you know, maybe 60 years ago, there was some conflict between two specific organizations, and it, you know, spawns into a thing where, you know, people automatically dismiss the thinking and dismiss the writing or, you know, ideas of someone who they consider as coming out of a particular camp, you know. And so, and we see that especially um, prevalent today with this idea of alternative facts. Or is it all facts, right? Or is it alternative facts or alternative news, fake news and alternative and all that, you know, this idea of these warring or competing and conflicting worldviews that determine everything down to the way that you perceive and understand reality. So two people can look at the same event and come away from it with two very different perspectives. And so this is especially prevalent today. And so you see that even you have certain titles that people use to paint a broad stroke of people in a particular light. So, like the idea of woke, the idea of woke, depending on your perspective, you know, someone might say, "Oh, that person is not woke," and they might mean that in a bad way. So, you know, since they're not woke, we don't have to consider any of their ideas, or we don't have to think about anything they have to say and take it serious. Or, you know, if, or some people use it in a negative way, so that, you know, if someone is into, for instance, like conspiracy theories or quote unquote conspiracy theories and all these other kinds of things, they might say that you're too woke, you know, and that could be a way of dismissing your ideas and your thoughts without critical engagement, without thinking critically about what you're saying, right? And so this kind of spin that gets put on reality facts, which gets put on events that happen, things that actually happen, you know, people walk away from them with different perspectives about what actually happened. And so we see this is very common today. And for people who want some type of social change and who want to make things different and who want to you know, change the power relations, um, you're talking about there's a whole spectrum of people who want to make change. And so the question always comes up as to, you know, where do we draw the line about who do we work with and who we don't work with? What's the basis? What's the platform of us working together? What's the etiquette and, you know, protocols of working together and that kind of thing? And so, you know, these issues are very important to have a clear understanding of and to have a clear position on in order to kind of navigate through some of the murkiness of it, as well as the intentional divisiveness of, you know, ideology and like the emphasis and the I would say overemphasis on ideology and how it gets in the way of you know, people working together. And so, how do we judge that? How do we understand that? How do we look at that? Well, we have to look at it historically, and we have to look at, you know, what historical facts are available to us to understand it, to appraise it correctly. And so, you know, there's lots of things that we could study, but we want to study from a perspective of people who are committed to making change. And so then that kind of narrows down our list of things to study from, in terms of where can we get some kind of understanding that's leading towards where we're trying to go with it, right? And we should study everything, but there's certain people that are uniquely qualified to guide us to understanding. And so Russell Maroon Schultz is one of those people. And so, you know, what he does with his writing is, instead of getting into too much pointing fingers at people about ideologies or too much loyalty to any particular group or a particular thing, he he lays out an understanding of historical events with as much objectivity as possible, and he lays them out as historical events, and he weighs them and measures them according to the details of what actually happened, and not so much about, you know, ideological understandings, interpretations, or loyalties, etc., in understanding historical events. And then from that, that can lead us to what's effective and ineffective, what's useful, what's consistent with our goals and aspirations, and we can avoid the things that we don't want to be involved with, you know. And by understanding it from a historical perspective, that's how we should define ourselves. That's how we should decide for ourselves what makes sense to us, what we want to stick to, what we want to avoid, versus what is being taught to a lot of people, and what gets carried on and handed down in various ways is, I already have a preconceived notion and conclusion, so I'm going to look at history for supporting evidence to my already decided conclusion. Whereas when reading Maroon's work, one has to flip that, and one has to arrive at conclusions based on what does history suggest is the case, you know. And yeah, so that's why I think it's really important for us to be reading his stuff. And sometimes you might think, well, yeah, you know, that's an interesting subject. I want to get into that. But you might just never get to it. Mm-hmm. It happens to a lot of us. And so by us creating this series, it gives people an opportunity to have some incentive to really dig into that work. It gives people an opportunity to engage the ideas along with other people. Maybe some of it they may not understand, you know, so they might get stuck in some places, and they might need other perspectives. And so, you know, by us doing this series in this way, it allows for us to take advantage of whatever excitement and enthusiasm we have about studying. It allows us to, you know, take advantage of working together and, you know, collectively seeking the knowledge. And for those of us who, you know, maybe already are studying things, already are digging into the stuff, it allows us an opportunity to sharpen the ideas that we've been working with. And so this is why I think it's really important to dig into some of this writing. And if you spend any amount of time reading Russell Schultz's work, you're going to see right away that his writing is unique. Is unique to compared to most other historians, and we have to consider him like a historian in the way that he writes. And when you read his work compared to a lot of other historians, there's something you know, immediately different, because we're talking about a practitioner. We're talking about someone who's studying this history and who, you know, earned the name Maroon by putting a lot of these things into practice. And so, when he's talking about the Maroons and the Dragon and the Hydra, um, this is someone who studied the history, learned what he could learn from it, applied it, and embodied it. And these are the kind of people that we should take from, and we should take from those people who the knowledge is something that they freely share, and more importantly, is something that they internalize and embody. And so, he's one of those people. And so that's kind of like a bit of background as to why I wanted to, why we wanted to dig into this reading more. And in this article in particular, we're going to be talking about centralized and decentralized efforts. And so, with everything that's going on today, you were looking at a lot of different types of efforts at organizing what appears to be disorganized chaos to the untrained eye. And so to the untrained eye, what we're looking at is chaotic, spontaneous uprisings, etc. But for the more someone with a more sophisticated understanding of what's happening, we understand that it's not all chaotic, and that there are many different elements involved, which are, implementing their strategy. So there's moves being made, and there's a lot of people making efforts to steer things in a particular direction, towards what they believe is right, what they're interested in, and etc. So there's different approaches that people are taking, and arguably what we've seen recently as most effective is decentralized. Is not the Black Lives Matter coalition. It's not the NAACP. It's not the it's not these sort of chapters and organizations that have a centralized leadership or centralized authority. It's a lot of different groups participating and engaging in different ways along an agreed upon strategy, if you will, in the sense of there is a general idea of resistance, which is what is agreed upon. And then various people engage and participate in resistance as they deem appropriate. And so there is a unified direction to it, but there is a very, very decentralized approach and perspective on tactics and types of actions, etc.
And that's the Hydra.
Yeah. So that's the Hydra. What we see in the past with organizations with centralized leadership and authority, we might see certain big shows of force on a certain day at a certain time.
Right.
But those things historically have proven to be less effective than the generalized, decentralized, constant battles and constant struggles and little skirmishes and all of these things, arguably. So now what we're looking at with everything that happened after the murder of George Floyd, we're looking at a general consensus that the police are no longer a legitimate authority.
Right.
Some people never considered them legitimate authority, but in general, the general attitude, the general understanding of this generation is they're not a legitimate authority, that they're abusing power, that they have too much power, that they go too far, that they have too many privileges, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole host of issues that are that people sometimes attempt to uh, garner and centralize in their organization. For example, the idea of the what is it, defund police?
Yeah.
So we can look at defund the police, or we can look at the what was that other coalition where there was one woman who gave a really
Until Freedom.
Until Freedom.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at defund the police or Until Freedom, what you're seeing is a centralized approach
Of the petty bourgeois class. And that's actually, now I wanted to ask you about this, Hannibal. Like, Russell Maroon Schultz is really interesting because he's critiquing also the petty bourgeois class within the struggle who are going to try to use their centralized power and engage in treaties with the authorities. So, that's one thing that was always something that, when we struggled in our actual fellow strugglers from our kind of mindset, that we always critique this treaty building to subdue potential mass militancy, right? And so this is one thing that Schultz is really remarkable on as a historian of struggle, that he's showing that was always the case. Even in Maroon communities, there were the ones who were given these treaties so they could, so that those like I think it was the Dutch or the Portuguese who tried to negotiate by engaging in treaties to then divide up the movement by cutting a deal, basically. And then by having those treaties, they would select a few people that would talk for the struggle, but they're not really from the struggle. So this would divide up. So then the Maroon communities would have to reorganize themselves into newer decentralized struggle. One of the things about decentralization that I thought, and you could correct me because you're much more well-read on this topic, I thought one of the things that Maroon was talking about was not like some kind of moral perspective that, decentralized power is better because power is bad. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think he's saying that it's just tactically really has been effective in Maroon communities when they were going after the colonizers, right? Am I correct on that? It was actually a tactical question, not really a moral question. Like, morally, decentralized is better. It was really about political power distribution and confusing the colonizer more and more. Right. And having the ability to escape all these different, obstacles that are, pushed by the colonizer.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, and he says, in the beginning of this particular article, a whole lot of what you read is going to sound like anarchism. Right. But I'm not an anarchist.
Right. Right.
And so there he's really making that point. Which any moral thing. He goes on to make an analogy, and he uses. Let me just go into it real quick.
Yeah.
That's an important point. Let me just remember where I had that up.
Was that in the same document? We're looking for your PDF.
The PDF.
I think I have the PDF here.
But basically, I mean, what he was saying is he made a point about a historical account of he made an point about this analogy of a guy who's having meditated on these vexing problems and come up with certain solutions, only to realize later that ancient people had already discovered those things and already expounded upon those ideas, which he thought were his own inventions. So he says, confound those ancients, for they've stolen all of our ideas. And he makes this point as a sort of it's like a preemptive refutation of anarchists wanting to claim it as sort of a prey to anarchism. You know?
Yeah. I remember the part you're talking about. He was saying that how way before anarchism even came in the scene, people were already doing these forms of decentralized struggle, which is not about having a value of anti-authoritarianism, which is sometimes bad forms of anarchism is all about that. Like if you say anything, you're questioned as an authoritarian. Well, I mean, recently I've been charged with that. Like, hey, you're an authoritarian because
let's look at it for a minute, right? I mean, these maroon examples give they give credence to the idea of the tactical effectiveness, right? So let's put a pin in that for a second, and then think about, you know, at least here within America, within the United States, you have generations and generations of people who were involved in some type of struggle here, and for whatever reasons they didn't succeed, and they either held firm to their ideology, or they maybe sought a different ideology that might be more effective, or they sought to improve it, or whatever what have you. But for many people, they've located ideology as the battleground of where the effectiveness is going to come from, or change to take place. So let's think about that for a second, right? And you know, they use history as a way of saying who had a correct position in this era and that era, so they can compare themselves to them, and then say, well, you know, we like the position that they took, so we're going to call ourselves after them, and we're going to say that we're of them, and we're going to say that they had the correct position, and, you know, we're going to interpolate, we're going to give our own interpretation based on our era, and we're going to apply these things to our time that we're living in, and we're going to use that to give value judgment to ideologies and their adherents. So let's come back now to the tactical effectiveness of the decentralized tactics. And if that enters into the discussion about effectiveness in resistance, which you're talking about, generations of people under the same oppression looking for a viable vehicle of resistance. So now you entered into that conversation, history of tactical effectiveness of decentralization. And I believe, personally, my own belief is that you have some people who, you know, they learned about a lot of this kind of history and said, well, you know, this just makes sense. You know, this is more effective. So therefore, this is the method of the righteous people. This is the method they should take. And then they argue with their peer or their colleague who believes that there should be a different approach. And they argue back and forth for the rest of their lives. And their students now fight with each other over that same argument. And so I believe it's like, you know, there was some tactical effectiveness, and then instead of inheriting it and taking it and expanding it tactically, people apply moral value and judgment onto that, which then changes the very nature of it. Because when you're talking about tactics, you know, you can have a morality that determines tactics, but tactics in and of themselves are not a morality.
Right.
You can have a morality that determines which are
Right.
viable and non-viable tactics, but the tactics themselves are not a morality.
That's right.
So you can have your tactics can reflect your morality, or they can merely be a reflection of what you thought was most effective for the time, which is what they should be.
Right.
You know,
and then that's one thing that Maroon talks about when he starts talking about critiquing Marxist-Leninism and that approach, right? And because that approach was specifically useful at a particular moment in Marxist history, but then he's showing that it also resulted in tremendous problems for struggle. So he wants to say, and that was the whole anarchist one, like, hey, look, we're looking at this, and some of you might think this is anarchism, but it's actually not. There might be some overlaps, and he welcomes that. He doesn't say reject it, right. But he's saying that the historical study is what's important, not looking at it as a moral ideology, but rather that how did the Maroons fight effectively? And they were actually successful on a number of, and he provided case studies, right? The Suriname case study, United States Maroons communities. He also talked about a couple of other locations, and he picks examples to show how people actually fought in slave communities. And it's interesting, though, actually, you know, his reading of capitalism is interesting because he's showing that Marx kind of forgot about the slave communities and did not pay enough attention. And so that's really necessary. And today, when we think about all the conversations that are happening, let's say the ultra left, let's say, that there has to be a recentering of the stuff that happened in Minnesota, the stuff we've known since Oscar Grant. Now it seems to be a different level of public consciousness about what's happening. And there has to be a rethinking of the Black question. And that's because of US history. And this is precisely what Maroon is talking about.
Right.
And the Western Hemisphere, where all these fights, indigenous Black people and Black people, and what's happening in this location.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, you know, you're trying to bake a cake, but you don't put no baking powder.
Right.
And you're wondering why it's not, you know, it's not coming out fluffy and moist and soft, because you've been leaving out a key ingredient in understanding what actually, how it came to be. So when you talk about a history of resistance, you can't be one-sided. You can't leave out a whole vast history of resistance because it doesn't neatly fit within the parameters of your ideology. And this is one of the big dangers about ideology, is because people take on an ideology before they really even studied the context it came out of. A lot of people take on an ideology because they hear a couple of things and they're like, yeah, I mean, I feel that way. And then someone next to them is like, you know, you sound like a communist.
Right.
You know, you sound like an anarchist.
Yeah.
You should really be that thing.
Right.
And they're like, yeah, like that.
Right.
I like titles and I like labels and logos and things. Maybe that'll make me like more interesting if I'm, you know, committed to that ideology, right?
It's really like kindergarten politics at that point. It's like so rookie because you actually, I mean, that's so easy to identify also for the powers, right? Like if
it's a game of, and this is what I was kind of getting at too about with the decentralized aspect, right? It's like, you know, when you start taking these tactics and trying to interpolate them into morality and trying to make your tactical approach to a numerical situation. When you're talking about a battle, when you're talking about fighting against slavery, oppression, etc.
You got to be creative.
You're talking about a numerical approach. You're talking about concrete facts. There's a certain number of oppressors. There's a certain number of oppressed.
That's right.
It's a certain square footage or certain square mileage of land that they occupy, and it's a certain square footage of land that we occupy. It's a certain distance between us. It's certain key positions that control the infrastructure of the society. It's all numerical. It's all concrete facts when you're talking about battle.
That's right.
So when you're talking about a decentralized approach, you're talking about an approach that's taken into consideration all of those numerical factors, the level of organization of the state, the level of organization of the oppressed people.
That's right.
The level of resources, this, that, and that. These are all basically numbers that you're taking into account to do a math equation, ultimately to try to decide the most effective use of what you have, which again is a limited resource, which is back to numbers. So when you're talking about all this stuff about, it's really ultimately about numbers and what's the best use of our resources, and resources including ourselves, our bodies, our time, our breath, our life, etc. What's the most effective use of those resources? That is essentially the conversation of centralized versus decentralized.
That's right. That's right.
But when people have taken themselves away from the battle long enough for multiple generations,
right,
they lose the context of the fact that these things were meant to be applied to a battle.
Right.
They weren't meant to be applied as an internal morality.
Right. It's not a moral code necessarily. Yeah.
And so they use these things as a morality, which creates divisions and conflicts, which manages and controls populations in particular ways.
That's right.
Which expands or contracts empire, which, you know, does these different things, which ultimately serve a group's interests, serve a person's interests, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
But ultimately, it's misapplied.
Right.
It's a misapplied approach because, again, when you're talking about battle, you're talking about numbers.
That's right.
So when you're talking about centralized and decentralized, you're talking about, can I beat that machine by myself?
Right.
If I can beat it by myself, then I'll fight it by myself. If I can't beat it by myself, then I need to get help.
Right.
And now we get together, I got some help. Now who's gonna direct us?
That's right.
Do we just all sound off on our own? Do we?
It depends on work, kind of, right? It depends on work.
It depends on the situation you're dealing with.
Right.
It depends on what you're faced with. It depends on the problem what you're faced with, and the resources you have available, the help you have available. You have to take all these things into consideration. So ultimately, that's, again, it's really about numbers. It's about concrete, objective, materialist types of things.
That's right. That's
right.
Well, you know, one of the things, if you don't mind me, one of the things in the essay that was really fascinating for me was when Maroon talks about non-state actors in the Islamic world in a positive way. There's very few people that I've seen from both earlier generation and this generation were able to have the courage to talk about this. And he's basically saying, you know, if you look at Iraq and the resistance to US imperialism there, that this is done by people who are extremely adaptable to their environment of war. That they're successful in their resistance is because they're not depending on one figure or two figures, that it's actually extremely decentralized and it's very creative. The other word he really loves is the word creative revolutionary, right? He mentions it and he talks about it as a mode of being, but also as a tactical question, like how you're able to kind of sneak out of these situations. Because first of all, let's be honest about stuff here. The United States is a superpower. In all these different states that participate and are complicit with the US, right? Like the puppet government in Iraq, it has tremendous state materials. So it's impossible to match that as a centralized power. You've got to fight in a very specific way.
Exactly.
Right. So I think this is really significant essay in that sense. The whole question of the Hydra. And we see so many examples nowadays, especially now since Minneapolis, it's kind of spectacle of a kind of weird reading of the Panthers as just centralized efforts, right? But the Panthers were doing, and the fact that it transitioned into BLA shows what decentralization is all about.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, you know, there is this sort of there's this luster to being part of a recognized,
right,
you know, leadership and organization, what have you. There's a sort of luster to oppressed people to have some kind of status.
Right.
And
Right.
one of the ways in which certain groups utilize that phenomenon is by vanguardism.
Right.
And so, vanguardism is where, you create a certain aura and status around people because they're part of the vanguard. And they're part of this select group of, elite leaders.
That's like the Big Six Malcolm was talking about. The local Black militant leaders that Malcolm likes versus the Big Six, paid for, supported, and commissioned by the white power structure. Yeah. And that's basically.
And so, when you've been, either quote unquote second class citizen, or you've been someone without status, you've been dispossessed all your life, it has an appeal to be recognized with some status, as part of some, thing with social capital, with resources, power, etc. To be like, even if you can't have the money of the capitalist, maybe you could have the status of the socialist, as a vanguard leader, because you could potentially, as a poor person, you could be the leader of the vanguard. It would be much harder to be, a capitalist.
But, exactly.
But a vanguard leader is definitely within reach. You know? And it's definitely achievable, even if you're not effective, you could still become a vanguard leader. So, it has an appeal. It has an appeal to people, and they play on that, and but what it comes out of, where they make their most gains, is with situations of decentralized activity. Because when there is decentralized activity is exactly when the imperialist starts searching for elites to dialogue with. And this is something that we can take from Frantz Fanon's writing. And even though it's not listed here, I think people should check it out.
Central,
The Wretched of the Earth, Black Skin, White Mass. You got to understand those things to really give proper context to a lot of this history that we're dealing with. But there's this idea of, there's this status that people can get, and there's this, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I was saying something about
Fanon, I think.
Yeah.
We can get back to it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of history. There's a lot of history of people taking advantage of poor people's need for status. And so I believe that's one of the main driving forces of how these groups still come about, and we see that they kind of dissolve. A lot of them have ultimately dissolved over the years until like skeletons of what they used to be today.
Right.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. So from Fanon, I was taking this idea of the imperialists searching for elites to dialogue with, right?
The national bourgeoisie, which works with the
So when you see police stations start catching on fire, look around, because out of left field, out of nowhere,
there's gonna be some leaders.
There's gonna be a coalition of leaders doing a press conference.
Trained by Al Sharpton.
You didn't know who they were yesterday, but today they're definitely the leaders. Today they're definitely like those are the leadership. We gotta follow them and do what they say. And so the point what I'm making with that is that it's the decentralized activity which concerns the imperialists. It concerns the imperialists because if it spreads enough, there's not one spot they can crush. There's not one head they can chop. So they have to corral it back under some central leadership, because
that
if
they can
there's
identify
central leadership,
Mhm.
they can cut their heads off,
or we were discussing
just
this,
tell them to do something different.
When we were
They can
talking RAM, we discussed
Right.
the same thing, right? That
Yeah.
Muhammad Ahmed was talking about how Ella Baker was important because she was not only interested in charismatic leadership, she was interested in multifaceted struggle.
That's right.
That's hard to kind of identify and
That's
surveil and assassinate.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Or even if you assassinate, it's not the end of the struggle.
Yeah, yeah, you know, so it's like if they got a centralized leadership that they can easily identify, they can just kill them.
Right.
They can just kill them if the threat becomes serious enough to them.
Right.
Right. But there's a number of other things they can do up to that point. And their favorite is to find one or two of them which they can buy, or control or manipulate, to then be able to manipulate the party. So if they can control or manipulate a central figure within the party, then they can control or manipulate the party. They can start creating an environment and creating a situation where the party has only a limited number of decisions to make. Right. You know. Right. Exactly. And then you're essentially at that point under their control. And so that's, you know, historically one of their favorite tactics to use. And so you find that, you know, when decentralized activity starts really coming up, they instantly come in with some type of leadership that issues a statement about discipline and issues a statement about, you know, who's the real leaders and these different agendas involved with this, that, and the third. Now, I can tell you right now, there's a lot of money involved with policy. There's a ton of money involved with policy. Right. There ain't a ton of money involved with breaking windows. right. So whenever windows get broken and something catches on fire, and people start coming up with, oh, there's outside agitators, there's people with ulterior motives, there's, you know what I'm saying, you know, there's this kind of undercover and that kind of undercover, and there's the Black Bloc, and there's this organization and that organization, and they all got their own agendas. You know, their agenda isn't the people's agenda, this kind of thing. Well, when you talk about the policy that you're working on writing, I can guarantee you there's more money behind policy. Right. There's more money interested in policy, tied up in policy, affected by policy, adjacent to policy. Right. There's way more money around policy writing than there is around people marching, making signs, and breaking windows, or whatever other thing that might have happened that people are saying was ulterior motives and whatever, right? So there's whenever there's a spontaneous uprising, you have these leaders, and all of a sudden they have this narrative that, oh, you know, there's all these other agendas. There's secret white supremacists in these crowds. There's that thing. Okay,
I was just noticing that they found out this, right? And all these so-called activists, right? You know, I hope you guys don't think we're activists. We're organizers. Here's the thing, like, you know, these activists are like, oh, look, the guy who was smashing the window was part of this white supremacist group, and they found out. I'm like, you know, my reaction to that, okay, I welcome that idiot to do that, because he's an idiot for his own cause. He actually did something that helps us. Right. So, okay. Yeah, and you know, hey, I'm not gonna be now using that as an excuse to delegitimize everything that people are doing. And the other thing is, you know, Until Freedom and all these other groups who are trained by basically Al Sharpton, they always define who the people are and how people should be. And the people are always defined as morally, unconditionally pacifist, nonviolent. Yeah. And I mean, you know, with the question of even like with what you were saying about they identify certain white supremacists, etc. Right. These same people who are talking about outside agitators, they will go and you know, go to a turkey sandwich with a redneck day. Right. You know. Right. Exactly. Or they have these events where it's like, you know, we convinced
this truck driver to leave racism alone.
Right.
He was from L.A.
Right.
That dude was from Berkeley.
Right.
You know, it's like
exactly.
You know,
exactly.
but you know, but they'll have you tell it that they're convincing the Klan to leave racism and what have you. Okay, so why can't they be involved with protests then?
Right.
So it's okay for y'all to go and have these like, we're gonna reform the heart of, you know, the Guantanamo Bay Guard.
Right.
And that's all well and fine. You know, we can accept him after he's been a guard at a torture facility.
You see?
But if someone shows up to a protest and they're part of a white nationalist group, then, you know, that's it right there. Right. I mean, that's the Nazis. The Fourth Reich is here. Right. You know what I mean? It's like this kind of like, you know, there's this kind of logic, and it goes back to what you were saying about how they define people. That's right. And they tell you how to be, and they tell you who's who and why is this and why is that, because ultimately what they're doing is they're doing their job. Right. They're disciplining the people into a mass that can be one mass that they can call mold. Or call off. That's right. They can call out or send home. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. They can call you out to their event. Right. And when you go out without them, they can come out and tell you to go home. Right. Right. That's their job. They don't just make the big sis. They also conceptualize the people. That's why I always, you know, for us, like the question, Islam is so useful, right? Because we're obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're servant of Allah. That's what we want to do, right? So whenever someone defines a people, we have to be very careful how they're defining. Yes. Because most of the time, it's a secular conception of what the people is. Yeah. And the people historically, again, historical understanding of the people is that the people is defined by the state. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about stuff that's against the imperialist state, stuff that's against the colonial entity, stuff that's against the plantation structure, right? And that's who defined people. So for us and for the various struggle, like someone like Carmichael defined people very differently. Someone like Malcolm defined it very differently. Yeah, and that's what we got to go with. Yeah, and it comes down to, you know, this idea of preparing people for these kinds of actions. So, you know, when you talk about the identity of, like, this very question it's a question of identity. Yeah, really, right? It's a question of what's your identity, and, you know, how you're categorized according to your identity. Right. And this article in particular, he focuses on Maroons as an identity. Yeah, that was super interesting to me. You know, because by merely dealing with that identity of people, it illuminates a whole lot of things. Right. Because by the way that people are characterized by self-interested groups, because there's a lot of self-interested groups that, as you say, they do the defining. Yeah, that's right. They do the characterizing, right? And they might have you miss something intentionally, right, to be able to see things the way they want you to see things. Yeah. And this is very common because, you know, these vanguard type parties today, right, their money comes from the donations of their membership. They exist merely by the donations of their membership. And so they want people to think in a particular way. They need people to follow them. They need people to, you know, do what they say. Because if not, they won't exist anymore. That's right. And right, you know, there's many ways of organizing an entity. But, you know, it's in their nature. It's in their very nature that they want to be the vanguard. They want their job to be telling you what to think and what to do and when, you know. Right. They want their job to be leading the suffering masses. You know, like that's their ideal job in life. That's their career. I have a great comment. So let me read that comment for our other listeners.
This is a great brother who's Brother Antonio. And he writes, I think he agrees with us, and he provides a lot of good information. He's saying tactics are free of ethics. I mean, I think he means morality. Ethics and principles are imposed upon them to create their limits, but tactics in and of themselves are truly unlimited except by material circumstances of the given moment. A good example of ideological assertions would be within the frame of Marxist guerrilla warfare. It's kind of the application of will to power over physical conflict. And then I'm going to skip over a little bit. And he's saying, those in struggle are in a constant state of learning and adaptation and function with an understanding of, in quotations, defeat and failure as necessary parts of struggle, and more importantly, to win. The last bit is a paraphrase directly out of the BLA study guide, BLA meaning Black Liberation Army. So thanks for that comment, Antonio. I appreciate it very much. Should we move on to the next piece really quick?
Yeah. I could go on. I didn't really take much quotes from this, but the article is The Dragon and the Hydra. And I would encourage you guys to really read this, because there's a high probability, we will discuss this in the future.
That's right. It's totally relevant.
And it will probably come up in future videos when we're talking about other things we may draw from this, because, we believe this is going to be one of those sort of foundational texts that helps us understand a lot of the things that we're seeing and everything that's going on. And just a reminder, Russell Schultz, Maroon, is sitting in a prison right now, and he's still consistent to the struggle. He's made lifelong sacrifices and worked tirelessly to be able to benefit us, to be able to offer some benefits to us from his efforts and his knowledge. And we wouldn't be able to have this conversation if he didn't personally take the responsibility of studying, fighting, being involved, and applying himself to the problem.
Yeah, no, that's extremely important. And we should remember Russell Schultz as a political prisoner and whatever that needs to be done. Inshallah, in the future, maybe his son would come.
Yeah, inshallah, we're trying to bring his son on here.
We're in touch with him.
Yeah, so inshallah.
So the other piece that I wanted to quickly talk about is called The Question of Violence. And this one, Maroon Schultz is sort of demystifying. He calls it demystifying violence, right? So it's very interesting because there are all these important pieces on violence, most importantly by Frantz Fanon, which everyone in sort of political theory we've read. This one is an interesting piece because he actually has a slightly different way of thinking about violence. What he does is he begins by thinking about physics. He's talking about physical laws and how in physics, when an object is taking an action, an object hits something, there's a reaction to that. And so for that kind of kinetic energy, there has to be a counter energy against it. So he's beginning by saying that violence and non-violence are not opposites of each other. That's actually the wrong starting point. And he's saying that the opposite of violence is counter-violence. That completely makes sense. It's like physics and laws of physics, right? So in order for violence to be deterred, there has to be a counter-violence against that original violence. And that's the first starting point that he's saying. And then he's showing how, by using three key figures, people who promote nonviolence kind of promote their ideology. So the three figures that generally, pacifists and nonviolent activists talk about are Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Jesus. And Russell Maroon talks about each, and he's saying, well, there's some other circumstantial environmental things that we have to consider before we actually discuss them. So what he's saying is there's always, in order for those, I'm good. Yeah, I actually have enough water. Yeah, thank you. We're having a very casual talk today, so this is like the Muslim Joe Budden podcast, which we just we need we were missing the white guy. We can get one of those exotic white Muslims with a few drops of pigmentation. No. That's not a good joke. That's not a good joke. We love everybody. It's the ummah. So check this out. So the Mad Mamluks better watch out. No, we love those brothers too, inshallah. So
if there's a exotic white Muslim out there listening who's like really looking for the brothers to get down with, hey, we'll take you.
We'll take you, inshallah. Actually, Russell Maroon Shows talks about white trash as a category that were changed up later by the races, right? They were the so-called hillbillies were engaged in, and they were, they come from a history of indentured servants and so on, and how that has a history of the question of the worker. He actually has a very different take on the question of the worker, right? It's very kind of slightly different than the Marxist model. So anyway, I mean, all joking aside, but yeah, connect with us if you doing some damage, inshallah, regardless of race. Now going back to the figure of Gandhi. So what Maroon Shows is saying, well, you know what? Gandhi was unsuccessful for the longest time. Very minor reforms were happening under this nonviolent philosophy, right? So what had happened was the global power of the British Empire was actually facing problems because of World War II. So because of that, British Empire lost its power because it had to engage in violence, and the counter-violence came from Germany and came from the allies of Germany as the British were engaged in World War II against them. And as a result, it's basically a militaristic, physical, concrete violence distribution of how much you can do. You have an overexpanded empire.
Of numbers.
A question of numbers.
When you
again.
get to battle, it's a question of numbers.
Right.
How many troops you got? How many battlefronts you got?
That's right. That's right.
You know, that kind of thing.
Exactly. So that thing by the Germans had affected British Empire's power in India. So as a result, Gandhi happens to be the guy who's the spearhead figure. And of course, Maroon didn't focus on it, but there were, violent movements, in the subcontinent also that created confusion for the British. So all he's saying is this logical statement that there has to be, even for nonviolence to work, so-called nonviolence, somebody else has to engage in counterviolence, whoever that is. And in Gandhi's case, the major force of counterviolence actually came from Germany and came from those forces who were engaged in. So in other words, if an imperialist power is busy fighting another power for whatever reason, internally, external, etc., is going to allow for certain nonviolent movements maybe to work. So in other words, it's never nonviolence by itself. That physical power, the kinetic energy of violence was faced with a counter-violence by other forces in the world. Number one, Gandhi, we're done with Gandhi. Number two, MLK, civil rights struggle, always given credit as this, all these legislations happened. First of all, legislation was critiqued by Malcolm anyway. But having said that, Robert F. Williams too. And those are two key figures for us. But why was MLK's, let's say, the civil rights, even the bill and all of the bills that happened, why did they happen, right? The main key factor Maroon Shows identifies is the decolonial struggles that were happening in Africa and Asia and how that created. And the second one, and this is why Malcolm X was assassinated, basically, is because he was going around talking about making a bad name for the United States and how they were treating their own, in quotation, citizens. The Black citizens were treated. And so there was this moral dilemma that was happening in terms of even global power shifting and creating problems on United States as a global power. So that created a lot of, again, mathematics or numbers, right? That the decolonial. And as a result, what had happened was the Southerners, actually the KKK, it was not a fringe group at the time. It was actually a major force. And groups like them were major force in the various institutions of the government involved, linked up with the KKK, right? And those factors, right, had actually a kind of counter violence internally within actually America's power structure, within various ranks of power. There were concerns about America's image, and all of that was kind of perpetuated by the decolonial struggles that were happening all over the world. And Malcolm kind of took the job of propagating this scandal of America throughout everywhere, right? So, he would go to Oxford and talk about how America is precisely like South Africa. And it only is, and that's why the word hypocrisy in Malcolm's language, America is a hypocrite, and South Africa does what it preaches. America preaches something else about democracy, but actually it does something else. Is precisely what South Africa does. That's not just a moral comment about American hypocrisy. A lot of your favorite Malcolm X scholars don't get to that point. The thing that Malcolm was showing by that hypocrisy thing is actually this propaganda of counter-violence that he was inviting against American imperialism overall in the world. He understood that within the US, there was a hegemony being created by the Big Six and others like him. So he had to counter that. And so this is very important. That created this harmony that allowed for actually the civil. And again, remember, Malcolm leaned over to Coretta Scott King and said, whatever I'm going to say is going to help your husband. And after he said that, he went off on King at that time being, compromised. Now, the third figure is the figure of Jesus. This is a historical study. So Russell Maroon Schultz is talking about, so we're not talking about the Quranic understanding of Isa alayhi salam. We're talking about Jesus, the way he is mythologized and understood in sort of white Christian history. And there, basically, Maroon Schultz provides similar information that, Jesus is always portrayed as completely peace-loving and never engaged in anything that was militant. That's the sort of the white notion of how he's promoted. But then, and his followers were really sticking to that. And then he shows that they all got extremely brutalized and tortured to the fullest extent possible, and by the Romans. And so he's talking about Constantine and how that kind of violence, had crushed, right? And the way Christianity becomes kind of world power is when the Roman Empire decides to kind of embrace Christianity and so on. So he's talking about there also sort of like the larger environmental history. By environmental, I mean political environmental, like not ecology. But, actually I saw that Maroon Schultz is actually also very interested in ecology.
Yeah,
which is which is very interesting, and he has a notion of ecosystem, has a notion of creatively looking at imbalance in the world. So anyway, so these are the three figures that he goes and kind of demystifies, and I think that's where I will end. Oh, the other thing, which is again going back to the whole Iraq example, right? Interestingly, Maroon Schultz also talks about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was waterboarded, I think, around 200 times. And he's talking about how did he manage to fight that level of torture. So it's interesting that as a political prisoner, he's looking at Islamist figures and how they're able to deal with violence. And so, I'll end it there. If you have any questions, feel free to ask us. Do we have any? I don't know. I should look at.
I haven't seen any comments on Facebook.
Yeah, I saw that one comment. Yeah, we kind of started.
We got a handful of people though. Is anybody on Facebook? Is there any burning questions or? And it could be something from this episode or one of the other episodes too. Is there any?
Right.
Any burning topics of discussion? I know we're early. Sorry about that. We have like a couple of things that we got to do today.
Right. I mean, I don't see any questions so far. Oh, I see Emmanuel. Emmanuel saying a lot of things here. Thank you for your comments. Most of these are comments. And so, let me see. Excellent. So thank you for these comments. And we really appreciate it. We're going to What's our schedule looking like right now? It's 9:53. We're pretty much in a good time now to kind of complete today's session.
Yeah.
We do have a meeting in the Bay. We're trying
Wait,
some of them.
one second.
Yeah. Is there a question?
Thoughts on Angela Davis?
Ooh.
You know,
I have stuff to say, but you can go.
You know, and this question could have come up over the last 4 decades. You know what I mean? It could have come
Not
up
a new
in
question.
any conversation, but there's new circumstances which
That's
are
right.
interesting and curious because she recently endorsed Biden. If I'm not
That's correct.
mistaken,
That's correct.
I was really surprised about that. You know,
Were you?
I was surprised.
Okay.
I was genuinely surprised. I was genuinely surprised because I understand. Didn't she endorsed Clinton before, right?
Well, she definitely fully endorsed
For
Obama.
Hillary. Okay.
Yeah.
So-
I don't know about. I don't think she did the Hillary thing.
Okay.
She said that the first time she voted was the Obama election.
Okay. So I mean, you know, what can I say? I think that first of all, let's put Angela Davis in the context that she came about in. First of all, because a lot of people.
Where's her co-defendant?
Because
that's a good question.
A lot of people talk about her as if
Yeah.
she arrived here on a light beam from a spaceship.
Right.
But I mean, she came out of a particular history.
Right.
She became prominent in a particular era.
Right.
She became prominent in the era of the Black Power movement. And
never a true member of the Panthers, by the way.
Yeah, so a lot
never
of people consider her as a Black
Mm-hmm.
Panther, but that she had a relationship with the Panthers, but she definitely wasn't. That wasn't her focus. That wasn't her movement per se.
Right.
Always been feminist, etc.
Critique Malcolm for patriarchy, by the way. You should read her essay, Malcolm as Our Image, in which she does that. And I think it's a horrible critique. I don't think it's a justified critique.
Yeah, I think, I think with Angela Davis, I think she's become so important to these conversations because how can I approach this question? There's a tradition in America, not just America, but it's very big in America, mm-hmm. of utilizing university spaces to influence struggle. And that tradition it has, I would say it has few merits. I would say it has very few merits. It had been used somewhat effectively in the past, but in our current state of affairs, and with everything that's transpired since the Black Power movement, and just the nature of university campuses today, et cetera, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like the most repressive space. Is one of the most repressive spaces because it doesn't just smash resistance. It like perverts resistance.
Right.
It like perverts struggle.
Right.
So you have these you have these courses and this culture that focuses on its favorite Black revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. They pick from an ocean, mm-hmm. one or two people that they like, mm-hmm. and they repeat their name to you over and over and over again until you think this was the commander of the whole Black Power movement.
Right.
And you don't have no context for their speeches that they gave. Right. Who were they giving a speech to? Where were they at? What just happened before that? What organizations were involved? What groups were involved? What issues were happening in the community at the time? Right. So, and this is intentional. and they take things out of context because you can't beat us with an outsider. They can't beat us with an outsider. Mm-hmm. They have to have someone within our ranks to weaken us.
We got to be very careful about this tendency, even in our generation, our struggle.
Yeah,
right? Yeah.
They can't. It's like a wildfire. Revolution is like a wildfire, mm-hmm. right? If it touches fuel, it's gonna catch on fire, mm-hmm. right? You can't fight a wildfire simply with water. Like that's right. When I was growing up, people would always say you don't fight fire with fire, mm-hmm. and generally, yes, that's true, except in the case of a wildfire. Mm. When you're fighting a wildfire, you can't fight it without fire. Right. Because what they do with the wildfire is they do controlled burns in order to draw mm-hmm. the larger body of fire into a fuel quagmire. Mm. That is to say, they draw it into a place where it will get suffocated. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. They use fire mm-hmm. to then draw the other fire into a place, and they do controlled burns so that it doesn't have nothing that it can connect to, right? Right. They draw it into an isolated space where it can suffocate for lack of fuel. And so this is what the revolution is. The revolution is a wildfire. It's a living, breathing thing. And when you draw it into isolated spaces, it suffocates. And so this is the tactic that they use against us. They find someone who is from among the revolutionaries, or they find someone who is close enough, similar enough, mm-hmm. Sounds like them, or whatever the case may be, but close mm-hmm. enough to then draw the larger mass of people mm-hmm. into these isolated spaces where nothing can grow. Right. And so my belief is that that's what she's been doing with her courses at universities. It's like taking the middle class and the petty bourgeois and giving them some type of influential authority over things that affect them less than the rest of us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So those people on the bottom who ultimately had the most to gain from revolution, they don't have access to this university revolution in the same way as elitist, middle class, petty bourgeois people do. Right. So they engage with it as a plaything. The revolution becomes like their plaything because it was like an elective course that they did in varsity. You know what I mean? It was like, it was a thing that, they got to just talk about in classrooms. They didn't have to go and be up at 5 or 6 in the morning to feed children in the breakfast program. Mm-hmm. They didn't have to go and, stand on the front line. They didn't have to go and sacrifice their money and work hard all day to do things for the community to benefit from. Mm-hmm. They didn't have to make personal sacrifices. All they had to do is go to class and dress, and they might even dress up and look nice and sit around and, pretend that they're having this riveting discourse, and maybe they are even, but ultimately that's not the revolution. Mm-hmm. Right? So they sit up and talk about revolutionaries as if they're equal to them. Mm-hmm. They don't study like, okay, let's learn from them and refine ourselves to make ourselves more more revolutionary, or to learn from them what was effective strategies that they had to approaching the problems. They sit up and deal with revolution as if it's their plaything. And this is not a diss to people in universities. Yeah. It's not. This is not a diss, but this is a reality in which I have to say that Angela Davis has encouraged a lot of that stuff. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She's encouraged it in the way that she's chosen to focus her energy on universities, mm-hmm. and the people that she's chosen to work together with and participate with and coalition with. Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't clear, by that.
We can look at the Biden example.
We can look at the Biden. I mean, come on, man. Come on. Like, you're talking about somebody who's responsible for mandatory minimums.
Right.
When we talk about Joe Biden
It's
and
very
his history
specific too.
with the prison system,
Right.
Joe Biden helped author the legislature that created mandatory minimums for Black men to get all of these years and years and years in prison. Right now, Angela Davis is supposed to be this, prison abolitionist, et cetera, but she is advocating for Mr. Mandatory Minimum. So I don't know what type of hypocrisy that is.
Right.
But it is something that confuses me. You always find these elder leaders who, they've enjoyed a ride without much challenge. They talk about things without much personal sacrifice for decades and decades and decades, while their co-defendant, like her co-defendant, languishes in prison.
Right.
And she's done all this thing and made all this money while her co-defendant, who she severed her case from, languishes in prison, and she won't even say his name. She won't even say his name, but she'll say Joe Biden's name.
Right.
Wait, so you can advocate for Joe Biden to be president, but you can't advocate for your co-defendant to be released from prison?
Right. And how can you advocate for Joe Biden, particularly now after Minnesota? It's just I don't even understand tactically how that works. Some of our viewers talk about tactics and pragmatism, and then talk about I don't want to go after Bernie Sanders again, but that's the whole thing I'm talking about. Like right now, we're looking at a post-Bernie phenomena, like this fetishizing an electoral person. Right now, it's clear that there was a tendency now of the first, when Minnesota happened, that there was a mass militancy happening. So I think it's really important that, and it's crucial information to pay attention to, that how Angela Davis is actually supporting electoral politics under the circumstances.
Yeah.
Here's the other thing I would say. This is a theoretical point, which is Angela Davis started intersectional analysis, one of the earlier proponents of intersectionality, and Kimberly Crenshaw. And I think we have done our panels with Tommy Curry, who talks about Black male studies, how intersectionality specifically targets Black men, and the violence that happens to Black men and other pigmented men are actually de-emphasized to suggest that they don't suffer from sexual violence, which is foundational kind of technique in the process of ungendering in slavery. And we know that from Afro-pessimism, we know that from Tommy Curry's work more clearly. And so theoretically also, I mean, as an intellectual, I don't find much promise in Davis's work, unfortunately. So that's where I will end it, right?
Yeah,
do we have other questions?
Well, yeah, the brother was responding to that too. So he asked, I'm assuming that's a brother. So he asked, do we think she had Jonathan Jackson? I can't really
say that.
comment on any of that stuff. And what I will say is there's a lot of controversy around that. And if you talk to some of the people who were around back then, like they won't even respond to your questions when you ask them about that stuff.
Yeah.
Like and I mean, depending on who you're talking to and what you're asking them, but a lot of times they don't even want to rehash this. A lot of times they don't want to rehash any of it because
it could be a distraction in a way.
Yeah. And there's different perspectives. I would say there's one book in particular that deals with that issue, which is Who Killed George Jackson. Which is, I mean, it's worth reading. I know they talk a lot about George and Ram, and they talk about some of the other sort of details around that time and everything that was going on. And
there is I would remind our viewers, there is an interview of Daruba bin Wahad with I Mix What I Like.
Yeah.
And in that interview, he kind of talks about problems that he has with Angela Davis politically. So these are not personal stuff. This is just political stuff about that particular era and some of the problems.
Yeah.
Are there other questions?
Yeah,
or?
there's one more question
Okay,
here.
inshallah.
Are there any lessons that overlap from both the Dragon and the Hydra and Black fighting formations, considering the fact that during the split of the BPP that the BLA was largely without above ground political support, and Panthers around the country were being called back to Oakland, essentially centralized a lot of the above ground logistical support and resources became out of the reach of guerrillas who are no longer or never were under BPP's authority. Are there things that we can see that connect with both articles? Yeah, I mean, I mean that those things are definitely connected, and I think in the vein that he's talking about organizational structure, I think he makes a point to labor at the question of structure, and notwithstanding is himself, BLA, Black Panthers, etc., and all of those things which you mentioned there, I think are if I had to guess, I would say that those are some of the driving factors of him writing this stuff. Is like understanding what happened, because when he talks about BLA in Black fighting formations, he talks about the fact that they sort of came along in a haphazard way, not entirely haphazard. I forget the words he used, but basically, when they were being formed, they were essentially being rushed through the process of formulating themselves, and so they were not as thorough with the formation. They were not as thorough with some of the details, and they were not as thorough with some of the structuring of the organization, which he believes he kind of cuts BLA some slack, saying that they were just basically learning from the times they were in, and but ultimately I think what he said was it was too little, too late, and so by the time they kind of got in motion, they were they were already sort of playing catch up, and it was an uphill battle because BPP was already embattled by the time BLA comes on the scene, and so and just as you mentioned with the with some of the things that Huey was doing and the Central Committee, it put an even greater huge strain on the relationships and support between them and the BLA, BGF, other Black groups. Some of the things that Huey was doing towards the end of the BPP was ultimately, how can it be articulated? And I want to be careful about this because I know that this history is very serious to a lot of people, and this was a lot of people's lives. Like, they lost people that they love. Some of them spent time in prison. A lot of things happen to people based on these politics and these events. And so, I would say, and how it kind of was told to me was that there was a certain point where there was these splits and there was these different directions that people were going in, where it was like decentralized versus the Central Committee.
Yeah.
Where a lot of people were like, look, we need to be doing stuff according to what's going on here, according to where we're at, according to our specific battle where we're at. And a lot of people believe that Huey was putting an overemphasis on retaining influence and retaining authority over this rapidly expanding and evolving phenomenon of Black militancy. And a lot of people believe that he became involved with chasing the authority and influence of the vanguard.
And there was also COINTELPRO. heavily involved.
Yes, there was definitely COINTELPRO, and that's one of the main reasons why we wanted to have Ward Churchill on here. And all of these things, we want to give proper context to, you know, when Malcolm was saying some of the things that he thought needed to be done, and these young people went about trying to achieve those things which Malcolm set for them. These are the obstacles, these are the context in which they went about trying to achieve those goals, you know. And so this is why their story is so very different from Malcolm's, because there were all these new developments that were happening around, you know, around them, around their organizations, and around trying to follow up on these things that Malcolm was teaching them. And so yeah, I mean, excuse me. There was definitely, and in both of those articles, we can find, you know, blameworthy offenses on the part of the Central Committee and Huey Newton. When we talk about Black fighting formations, there's a part in Black fighting formations where he talks about how Huey and some others went to the East Coast to deal with some conflicts and what have you. And before they left, they ended up enlisting the New York Police Department as their bodyguards. So Huey Newton was going around New York as the leader of the Black Panthers with New York Police Department bodyguards. This is the kind of thing that will definitely create division. This is the kind of thing that will definitely create division and will definitely create a lot of pressure on the conflicts, you know. And you know, we see other things like that. There's a number of other things which are not as well documented. So I don't want to dig too deep into that. But we know that, you know, Maroon is mentioning those things in these articles. And when he talks about these vanguard parties and how they get involved with, you know, trying to, what's the word he used? Trying to suppress the masses, or
was it repression? I don't know.
Anyway, there's a phrase that he uses where he talks about how the vanguard parties get involved with trying to control the masses and discipline the masses into their party line. And, you know, there are many people who believe that's exactly what Huey Newton was doing towards the end of the Panthers and the Central Committee.
Yeah, that's what we're talking about, late Huey. So that's a different story. We have answered everything?
I believe so. Let me just double check here.
Inshallah. This was a great opportunity to have a conversation and do this together. And it was a nice little experiment for us. Inshallah.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
I would like to thank our viewers, Jazakallah khair, for your participation. We see some of the brothers and sisters who are regulars join in. That's so really great to see that kind of participation. We're going to return next Saturday and our usual time, not this early. So inshallah, we'll have more people then. And we'll update you about specifically what the next episode topic will be, and we'll send you resources accordingly. In the meantime, again, make dua for this brother in Bangladesh who got taken away a couple of days ago by the regime forces. We have a tremendous war going on all over the world against Muslims, against Islam. And we have to think about that, because it's not simply about just people who become imprisoned in places like Bangladesh. It's people who are disappeared. So they become sort of a number, and we don't even know how to respond to that. So inshallah, follow us on our Facebook page and for more updated information about the fundraiser, about our next episode. We're going to provide a new link for the fundraiser, inshallah. Someone asked a question. the brother's name. Um, let me see. Someone asked a question about the brother's name. Yeah, he's a brother who is. His name is Ashraf Mahdi. Ashraf Mahdi. He's a very good brother, solid brother. I know him. So this is something I've been dealing with for the last 10 years or so, since 2013 actually, ever since the massacre of Islamic practitioners in Dhaka, which was sort of prior to what happened in Egypt in August. So this happened in May. So ever since then, there's been a particular kind of attack against the younger ulama who are not quietists. So Ashraf I really hope he's okay. We saw his update a couple of days ago when he was getting taken away. He put up a very important information. So I'm waiting for some signal from back home to say what's the best approach to deal with his case. And inshallah, we're going to raise some awareness as needed, as wanted by those who are the closed ones of Ashraf, inshallah. So this episode again is dedicated to Ashraf Mahdi, our very dear friend and brother in Islam. Inshallah. So we'll see you again next week. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.